Hello, beautiful community. This is going to be much more than a chat about a slogan. We're going to go into questions of how we use language when we conflict politically, whether it's about something at home or whether it's about Western support for Ukraine or whether it's about Ukrainians making arguments about getting support. So it's going to be almost topic neutral. And we won't just look at how we engage in conflict, but also at a very simple idea that I'll share in this chat. That will be an idea of what it means for a citizen's view on something to be reasonable as opposed to unreasonable. And that's a view you'll see from me, Time and Health, allowing in the future in print, both in a general format for everybody and in an academic format too. And I think it'll be very healthy for us to explore that today a little bit, because it'll free us a bit of the prejudice of wanting a reasonable view for a fellow citizen to contain our way of looking at the world, right? Which is often dangerous, especially in an age of polarization. And in the process, we will say something about the slogan "from the river to the sea," used widely, particularly around the West recently, in pro-Palestinian protests. And what I'm going to say about that slogan is going to be of the 17th order of importance, because we'll really focus on the process of political language and sloganization, not on the particular topic. But on the particular topic, I'll say that whatever your view is, that slogan is more counterproductive than productive, because of an ambiguity in it that can only be resolved by asking people to engage with the history of the slogan. That is going to be, in my terms, a request that is just too heavy and too excessive to be politically constructive. So let's take a couple of examples of using arguments and making requests that require too much heavy lifting by making people attend to an historical account that itself requires many controversial assumptions, or by making people attend to philosophical views and philosophical assumptions that are both controversial and too dense, too elaborate to be politically useful in the context that most makes sense to focus on when we do politics, which is the doorstep, right? What can you make clear on the doorstep to somebody in 1 or 2 minutes flat, if they are reasonable? And so we'll come back to this issue, what a reasonable voter's view is. So let's just take a couple of examples to start with. There's huge inequality globally and in Western countries. It sometimes can be tempting to say, well, the richest Western countries are surely okay, but even here, there are people who live with fear, the fear that they won't be able to provide with their family, for their families, and then a double fear, the fear that that fear will persist. And yes, that's a fear that's very different to somebody escaping a war zone and risking their necks, their children's necks in Africa or in the Middle East, but it's real too. And one left-wing argument that comes about, and there are 77 different left-wing arguments that come about here, but one left-wing argument that comes about says that inequality is only justified if it is shown that somebody's got stuff, has got resources, got money, in virtue of things that they actually control and not in virtue of just luck and so on. And very often that argument, I won't name names in books because I just want to spend a minute and a half with it, no more. And often that argument is made via what is quite frankly a position on the theory of free will. There's some sense of radically voluntary action, and then there is action that isn't radically voluntary in the same way. And of course, that view actually tumbles if you think that no action is radically voluntary in the way that it says. But what we've got here is a position about politics that ends up with us debating what I control ultimately and what I don't control. So I'm doing well at my job, so that's in my control. Do I control my talents? Maybe not, but do I control my cultivation of my talents and how hard I work to cultivate my talent? But isn't the talent for developing my talent itself a talent that I might be just lucky to be born with? Is it not? So we have this regress that ends up being a philosophical conversation when we're trying to do, relatively robust political debate and engagement, which should always be modeled on something like a football being thrown about. If your concept, if your language is very far from being able to survive being a football that gets thrown around, so that if you throw it to me and I throw it to somebody else, across the three of us, we still have a vague idea of what we're holding, right? That even if a bit of the leather comes off, even if it falls a bit into the mud and I still pick it up, that there's still got to be enough clarity about what it is that's being thrown about, right? I don't need to go and read 4 books to understand what it is that's being thrown about, right? So this is an example of an argument that violates that football principle. Here is another example. Sometimes people advocating for action on the climate crisis go on TV, on the radio, and say we need a fundamental transformation in our relationship with nature, and we actually have to start here. Now that can be part of the conversation in some way. It can certainly be an important part of private conversations. But the idea that you put that front and center in political advocacy when you address the general public is somewhat difficult to take seriously, because it fails the football test, it fails the doorstep test. Knock, knock, knock. Who is there? It's me. I'm here to talk to you about the importance of good climate policy, because what it's really about is changing your relationship with nature. It's just about really just refreshing yourself really ontologically. If that's, if you're open to that, I think that's really the best way to start. I've got this book here. It's called Being and Time. I know it's 7:29. You're back from work and you're cooking dinner, and one of the kids is unhappy about something, and you're having a fight with your spouse. And I'm just going to sort of just nail you really politically onto this really important idea of how to reevaluate your relationship with nature. You know what I mean? Nature, I can see you got a garden. Did you do a barbecue? Well, the barbecue was outside, so it's kind of, nature was, it's already kind of probably aware of what I'm talking about. It's just about taking that to the next level. Just give me 30 seconds here. I'm going to read this, just a couple of sentences really from Being and Time. That Dasein should be together only when it's not yet has been filled up is so far from the case that it is precisely then that Dasein is no longer. No, I know you're going like that to me when I'm reading. There's just one more sentence left. Any Dasein always exists in just such a matter that it not yet belongs to it. But are there not entities which are as they are, and to which a not yet can belong, but which do not necessarily have Dasein's kind of being? You got that, mate? I reckon that'll sort you out. All right, cheers. See you later. And you're going to vote in the right way now? I think you will. I think you've really got it now. So what we're saying is we do not want excessive, historically interpretive, or metaphysical, or ontological supplements, right, to be present in our political proposals and our political slogans, because that's not going to pass the doorstep test. You can talk about lots of other things too. What else can we think about? Bernie Sanders' slogan of democratic socialism, for example. I mean, as a philosopher, I don't see anything socialist in Bernie's program. But that's a term that cannot be explained on the doorstep in 2 minutes flat. So now that we've taken a few examples, let's put on the table what it would be reasonable for a citizen on the doorstep to think, and what it would be unreasonable for them to think about any issue in the world, right? Be that US policy on Ukraine, be that the extent of injustices committed by a certain state, doesn't matter. Be that what should happen with the medical system in your country. And there are 4 ingredients that are all procedural to what it takes, I think, for us to call a view a fellow citizen has reasonable. Now, first of all, that view has to be sincere. They should be not BSing us about it, right? They really believe it, basically. Second, it should be steady. Steadiness is hugely important because without steadiness, you don't get belief at all, right? You don't believe in anything politically, or in any other way for that matter, if you think it on a Tuesday, don't think it on a Wednesday, and think it again on the Tuesday the following week. So a good example of a political actor, for example, who doesn't really have many beliefs is Donald Trump. Donald Trump has dispositional states that fluctuate, but he doesn't really have many beliefs. So you do not want a dispositional state. You want something that is steady enough to be a belief, right? The third criteria is that it should be thoughtful. It should be something that you have thought about. And you might say, does it mean that they should have thought about it well? And my answer is no. They should have just thought about it with a minimal level of energy and a minimal level of time investment, right? So how do I pass this test in a way that I can be absolutely comfortable that I've passed it as a citizen, Vlad? What have you got a sort of image for me here? Sure. Let's say you want to find out if Israel is engaged in apartheid. And you read the Amnesty International, you read the B'Tselem, you read the Human Rights Watch reports about it. So Vlad, how do I find out if I am thoughtful in my response to these, such that I reject what they say or accept what they say or something else, something in the middle? I would say, read the damn stuff, or read some of it, shut up for a month, and then check if a month later your view has evolved or your view has changed. And wherever you are at that point, I am more than comfortable to say that it's thoughtful, no matter what view you take. Okay, so that's how that might work. There is a fourth criterion that's very, very important, and that is that it should not contain glaring factual error, but the factual error should be glaring. It should not require very much interpretation. Now, you might say every factual claim requires an interpretation, right? Russia invaded Ukraine could be disputed by some, because they might say, well, it's true that 2 armies are fighting in Eastern Europe, but from the point of view of Putin, as Ukraine on his terms doesn't exist, it's controversial whether he could invade the country that doesn't exist. And therefore, that claim that Russia invaded Ukraine requires more interpretive assumptions than the claim that 2 armies are fighting in Eastern Europe. I actually think Putin would himself admit that Russia did invade Ukraine in most moods and for most purposes. But you're seeing already how there is an evolution of how many assumptions are required, right? So factual judgments are not all equally flat. Some are more minimal, they require fewer presuppositions, others require more presuppositions. So when we say glaring, we really do mean that it should require a minimal presuppositions. I do think that Putin invaded Ukraine would pass the test in this case, right? But that Putin is engaged in ethnic cleansing wouldn't pass the test. It might be a view I'd recommend, but it's not going to pass the test of a factual claim. It's going to be an interpretive claim. Now, so obviously, if somebody says Donald Trump is going to make America great again, you cannot say that that involves a glaring factual error. But if somebody says the earth is flat, then you can say that. So we've got sincerity number 1, steadiness number 2, thoughtfulness number 3, and avoidance of glaring factual error number 4. So let's turn now, with this little bit of prep we've done, to from the river to the sea, the slogan that's then matched with the sentence that comes after, which is Palestine will be free. And I've made a note of 3 points I think I want to make about it roughly. Number 1, it's ambiguous. Now, I am not somebody who is unfamiliar with the region, who is unfamiliar with the Israeli story, who is unfamiliar with the Palestinian story. But I don't know what you mean when you say that. Now, do you mean something very benign, like Palestinians on historic Palestine should have rights, in whatever capacity that manifests, a two-state solution, a bi-national state, whatever else, I don't care? Do you mean that Israelis should move to New York? What do you mean? And the response often would come, well, just look at the history of the slogan. But here is the problem. We already talked about the introduction of heavy historically interpretive elements, heavy metaphysical elements, heavy ontological elements being introduced into political discourse in a way that's unsustainable. And so I think there are people who are going to know the history of that slogan much better than me, but I know it a bit. And if I need to go up and read up to understand what you mean, which is often the answer, go read up the history of this slogan. If you're saying that to me, then imagine how preposterous that is to a citizen who vaguely wants to make sense of what the hell is going on. So turning to that history isn't something you can really ask a citizen to do, because it simply creates ambiguity and typically a distraction from whatever it is that you're trying to focus on. Now, of course, I'm not recommending anybody to drop the slogan here, except perhaps people who are genuinely asking me if they should drop it, simply because that stuff's hard, right? There's a tradition of using certain language and so on. But insofar as I'm making any recommendation, am I recommending against it? Yes, I am. So let's say a little bit more about this. The trouble is that you can't tell me to focus on the history of the slogan so that I grow up and grasp that it means something benign. Because I already know some of the history of that slogan. And if that is not enough and I need to know even more, then that slogan is far from being politically effective for whatever end you are pursuing. Now, you might come back to me and say, well, you're only pursuing a kind of expressive politics and you're not looking for any effective change. But very few people would say that. People would say, I'm looking for some effective change. And what change is it? Well, it's perhaps for presumably your government to make Israel's response to the terror attack of Hamas stop or be more proportionate or something in that direction. Well, you're not going to get that if you're basically asking me to go read articles about it. Especially in my case, when I could probably write an article about it. I wouldn't be qualified to do so. I'd probably get away with it without Googling anything up, So what's the actual history of the slogan? I do think that the preponderance of the history of the slogan on the Palestinian side probably rests with something like a secular binational state, right? So there are statements from, I don't know if there are statements from the 60s, there probably are. There's certainly statements from the 70s, from Fatah and from Arafat, which say, how about a secular state on this territory where everybody, Jews, Palestinians, have dignity, rights, inclusion, and so on. Then I think the history at the level of political discourse loses that image by the late 80s and early 90s, when what's being looked at is a two-state solution that ties less neatly with this idea. From the river to the sea. And in certain ways, this story has the slogan has continued to live on despite around that time the discourse of a sort of a binational state disappearing from Palestinian political representatives. Now, imagine what I've said is roughly true. That's the sort of cartoonish beginning of a sketch about what the history of the slogan is. Well, you cannot ask people to do that history. It's a separate question whether what we come out with here is very reassuring for the slogan, because presumably a binational state imagined like that may require the dismantling of the state of Israel, right? How are Israelis going to feel about that? But the point is, I've just done that little bit of history and it's already politically too much. The reality is that the reasonable voter, who is not terribly immersed in this discussion, and that perhaps is a category that's more restricted than would have been before because of the radical polarization of this conversation, particularly on social media. But the point is that a reasonable person is going to be struck by the ambiguity of this. So let's ask some questions about how it's reasonable to interpret this slogan. As it might manifest on the streets of London. Is the slogan genocidal? In my opinion, for all its ambiguity, on balance, it's not. Now, that doesn't mean that a reasonable voter couldn't conclude that it is. But I'm saying that the preponderance of a reasonable response might be that's over milking it a bit, that it's not. Does it suggest ethnic cleansing? That's more plausible, that there could be echoes of that there, whatever the intent is. And you can't go around and say, read the history, do the history, and then we're going to see that you're fine. That, We're not proposing ethnic cleansing. Does it suggest a binational state? Perhaps that sounds plausible. Does it suggest a two-state solution? Well, not quite so easily. Although I suppose it could, in the sense that if you're just talking about everybody on that territory having rights and Palestinians just having rights on that territory, is compatible with Israelis having rights on that territory. Sort of, what does it say about gross injustices that need to be rectified? Do these primarily go back to 1967? Do they go back to 1948? What do you mean? So this is a significant degree of ambiguity. And the question that then arises, who means what empirically by this slogan? Let's say it's a protest in London. Well, I do think actually in London, the majority of people on a protest, if it's a big protest, would be in favor of the existence of the Israeli state as part of a two-state solution, or they would want a binational state where the rights of Israelis and Palestinians are respected. I think that would be the majority of the people who would use that slogan. But how big a majority? Who knows? The way these protests work, and I myself am personally completely unmotivated by expressive politics, which often means that I don't do protests. But when I was much younger, I was involved in some of the protests against the Iraq War. I was still an undergraduate around 2002, and I even did a little bit of organizing around that. So I know this environment well. And what you often get on very, very big protests is you get big pockets that overlap and involve a lot of subdivisions, and then you get lots of little pockets. And you can actually find just about anybody there. One of the things that was still possible to do back then, over 20 years ago, is to find a Stalinist pocket in a protest, which would often be about 4 or 12 people. And I would do that, and I'd ask them about Stalin. And they'd give me various kinds of ideologically textbook answers. And I suppose you could film these people in a way that made it seem like it was a significant part of the protest. If there were 12 of them, you could just about capture a shot where it looks like there's a lot of them. There was always just a couple of handfuls. So you've got to be careful making these empirical distinctions of, who thinks what at the protest. And you're obviously going to find a lot of people using that slogan who do use it in a way that says that Israel shouldn't exist. But that will not be the majority usage. So I am saying here politically, on the basis of all of this stuff that we've thrown about on the canvas, that if what you're trying to do has an expressive element, an effective element, it's not just expressive politics, I stand for this, I'm in solidarity with that, but if it has an effective element, which says I want to stop certain things happening, let's say I want to put pressure on my government to make Israel's response stop or be more moderate, I don't think that slogan is effective. I think it distracts from whatever goals you are pursuing, right? Now, obviously, some people who think that Israel's response is entirely proportionate, I recommend against that view, but they're not going to care. They're just going to say, well, of course, we don't like that slogan. But if you think that Israel's response is not proportionate, right, and you want to have your state put pressure, then I'm saying that on the basis that we assume that that's your political position, the slogan is not effective. In practice, the vast majority of people who use that slogan fervently, of course, when you say that to them, will come around and say, go to hell. Screw you. Of course, we're going to use this slogan, and you are propping up X, Y, Z, bad political policies, bad political outcomes, and go away. So, of course, we're not trying to change usage here and think that that's going to work by discussing it. Will change the usage. No, but the point is, we're talking about what works, what's effective, and now we've put this further distinction on the table about effective versus expressive politics. Let's end with one last distinction, which I won't explain much, but you know that I've talked a little bit about hyper-identity politics in the West. And what I want to say is that people using that slogan is, in my view, not hyper-identity politics on the whole. It's identity politics. So when we talk about identity politics, I want us to think about it in, I want you to realize that I think about it in two boxes. That was dangerous. I was almost imposing a view on you. The first box is identity politics that can be either constructive or destructive, and I just call it identity politics. It can be good, it can be bad. Just, both are possible. But then there is hyper-identity politics, which is always bad. And you can't define hyper-identity politics in terms of particular views or particular positions. It's a social practice that needs a sociological explanation. But if you forced a sort of example in terms of a view, here is one. You can't understand the climate crisis unless you understand white privilege. Right? That's a hyper-identity politics position. That's in almost 80-90% of its usage context is going to be counterproductive. Not because there aren't issues about racism and so on, but because you are working towards the recognition of an issue in a way that just mitigates against solidarity, against discussions of the public good that involve citizens with different points of view. I don't think there's any evidence of hyper-identity politics to this slogan, but what there is an evidence of just identity politics that in this case happens to be more counterproductive than productive if you support the idea or support any of the ideas that people using that slogan are trying to effectively and politically push. Do I have anything else to say? No. That's it. So it's very important that the sideways look aspect of this conversation is what matters. The particular recommendations on issues don't. Lots of love and talk soon.